Miles Davis said it in the way that Miles Davis said most things he believed, directly, without apology, with the particular quality of someone who has decided that the question of whether the statement will be well received is less important than whether it is accurate. He said it in interviews across several years in the late 1940s and into the 1950s as bebop was establishing itself as the dominant aesthetic argument in jazz, and as the musicians who had made that argument were defining themselves against the generation that had preceded them. The word he used was Uncle Tom. The charge was that Louis Armstrong's performance style, the broad smile, the handkerchief, the warmth directed outward at every audience, regardless of their composition, the quality of accessible generosity that had made Armstrong's public persona among the most recognizable in American entertainment, was not authentic expression, but accommodation. That it was the performance of a kind of approved black cheerfulness, a performance calibrated for the comfort of white audiences, a presentation of self that confirmed, rather than challenged, the expectations that white America had about what a black entertainer should look like. The charge was not uniquely Miles Davis's. It was a version of a critique that the bebop generation had been making, implicitly and explicitly, about the generation of jazz musicians that had preceded them, about the relationship between entertainment and art, between what a black musician owed an audience and what the audience's comfort had historically required. Bebop had been, among other things, a deliberate rejection of that relationship. The music was difficult, the tempos were fast, the harmonic structures were complex in ways that made casual enjoyment without serious attention difficult. The performance style was cool, turned inward, refusing the outward warmth that swing had offered. Miles Davis was the most elegant and the most publicly articulate representative of this position. He embodied what the bebop argument looked like in a body: the turned back, the refusal to announce songs, the suits of European tailoring, the complete absence of the smiling accessibility that Armstrong's public self had made the lingua franca of jazz performance. He was everything that the new argument was, and his statements about Armstrong were not simply personal opinion, but the position of an entire aesthetic movement making itself legible by defining what it was against. Armstrong was in his late 40s and early 50s when these statements were circulating most actively. He was, by any external measure, at the peak of his public career, touring constantly, recording, appearing on television with increasing frequency, reaching an audience that the bebop generation, with its deliberate difficulty, was not reaching. He knew what was being said. The jazz world was not large enough for the criticism to go unheard, and Armstrong was too embedded in the life of the music to have missed the general direction of the bebop generation's argument about what he represented. He did not respond the way people expected him to. He did not produce a public rebuttal. He did not call a press conference to explain his performance style. He did not write an open letter to the jazz press addressing the specific terms of the charge. He smiled. He played. He continued. There was one moment in which Louis Armstrong did speak. It was not about Miles Davis specifically. It was not a point-by-point response to the Uncle Tom charge or to the bebop generation's broader critique of what he represented. It was something that arrived from a different direction entirely, and it revealed, when it arrived, that the silence had never been the silence of someone who had nothing to say. In 1957, when President Eisenhower declined to send federal troops to enforce the integration of Little Rock Central High School, when the photographs of black children being turned away from school by armed white mobs were circulating in newspapers across America, Armstrong canceled a State Department tour and gave a statement to a journalist that used language the public had never heard from him before. He used direct, specific, unsparing language about the president and about what the president's inaction meant. He said things that those who had spent years characterizing him as accommodating had to account for, because what he said was not accommodation. It was the statement of a man who had been watching what was happening for a long time, and who had, at this specific moment, decided that watching in silence was no longer the correct position. The jazz world took notice. The press took notice. People who had accepted the bebop critique's characterization of Armstrong as someone who had traded his political identity for commercial acceptance encountered in 1957 a different fact. Armstrong was not without political consciousness. He was without political performance, which is a different thing. He had been carrying the consciousness for 30 years and expressing it in the music and in the private conversations of people who knew him, and he had been choosing, as a matter of strategic judgment about what was most likely to be effective and least likely to destroy what he had built, not to perform it in the public registers that the bebop critique would have recognized. When the moment required a different choice, he made it, without apparent difficulty, without the quality of someone discovering a political voice they hadn't known they had, with the directness of someone who had known what he thought for a long time and had now decided that the time for saying it had arrived. Miles Davis, who lived long enough to look back at Armstrong from the distance of decades, revised his assessment in the way that honest people revise assessments that time has given them better information about. He said things about Armstrong in later interviews that were different in quality from the Uncle Tom characterization, more complex, more attentive to the specific history that Armstrong had navigated, more willing to acknowledge that the simplifications of the bebop argument had not fully accounted for who Armstrong actually was. He never fully retracted the original statement. It remained in the record. But alongside it, in the later interviews, was something else. An acknowledgement that the man he had dismissed as an accommodator had, at a specific moment and in a specific way, demonstrated that he understood exactly what was happening in America and had his own clear view of what it meant. That the smile and the statement were not contradictions, that they had both come from the same person. To understand what Armstrong was choosing when he chose silence, it is necessary to understand what the smile actually was, which requires going further back than the bebop critique was interested in going. Louis Armstrong had grown up in New Orleans at the beginning of the 20th century, in a neighborhood called the Battlefield, in conditions that those who document the history of black life in the American South at that time describe with the specific vocabulary of a world that required careful navigation in order to survive. The specific forms that racial subjugation took in New Orleans in 1910 and 1915 were forms that Armstrong learned before he learned to read, in the way that children learn the rules of the environment they are born into, not as abstract principles, but as embodied knowledge, as the texture of daily life, as the thing you simply knew without needing to have it explained. The music was the way out. Not because music was outside the structure, nothing was outside the structure, but because music was the domain in which the structure's rules were, occasionally and partially and at significant personal cost, navigable. A musician could go places that other black men could not go, could earn income that other channels did not offer, could achieve a form of visibility that the structure otherwise denied. The navigation was not simple, and it was not free. It required compromises that those who made them understood as compromises, not as the erasure of identity, but as the price of operating in a world that had not yet decided to offer different terms. Armstrong had been navigating this landscape since he was a teenager. The warmth he directed at audiences was not a calculation designed to placate white expectations. It was, in its origins, the real thing, the genuine quality of a person who was constitutionally disposed toward warmth, whose musical identity had always been organized around the relationship between the performer and the people listening, who understood the concert not as a demonstration of personal superiority, but as a shared event in which both parties had something to give and something to receive. What the bebop critique read as accommodation, Armstrong experienced as expression. What Miles Davis read as the performance of approved cheerfulness, Armstrong had arrived at through 50 years of being genuinely a person who found pleasure in making people feel good, who regarded this as one of the highest things music could do, not as a concession to the audience's limitations. These were not the same argument. They were two different understandings of what music was for, two different positions on the relationship between artistic integrity and audience accessibility, two different assessments of what a black musician's public self should look like in mid-century America. Neither was simply right. Neither was simply wrong. But Armstrong understood this better than Miles Davis did at the time, understood that the complexity of the situation didn't yield to the clean lines of the bebop argument, and that his silence was not the absence of a response, but the refusal to respond on terms he found inadequate. What the silence revealed, once the full arc of Armstrong's life became visible in retrospect, was something more complicated than either side of the original argument had room for. Miles Davis had said that the smile was accommodation. Armstrong had not said that the smile was not accommodation. He had simply continued smiling, and continued playing, and continued reaching the audiences he was reaching, and had, at the moment when the situation required something different from a smile, produced something different. The question the silence answered was not the question Miles Davis thought he was asking. Davis was asking, why does Armstrong perform in this way? The answer from Davis's position was obvious, because the way he performs is what white audiences want. But Armstrong's silence was answering a different question. What is the correct way to navigate the specific landscape of mid-century American entertainment if you are a black musician who has been doing so for 50 years and who understands that landscape with a specificity that someone who arrived at its edges in the 1940s does not yet have? This was not ultimately a question with a single correct answer. Armstrong's way was one way. Miles Davis's way was another way. Both had costs, and both had returns, and the assessment of which cost was more acceptable and which return was more worth having was not a calculation that resolved cleanly from the outside, and was not one that the musicians themselves agreed on, and was not one that history has settled. What history has settled, or at least what the decades since both men's deaths have made clearer, is that both of them were doing something serious, and that neither of them was simply wrong. Armstrong's performance style was not the erasure of his political self, as 1957 demonstrated, and Miles Davis's turned-back coolness was not the refusal of all audience relationship, as his most devoted listeners demonstrated. The silence was not weakness, it was judgment. It was the judgment of a man who had been inside the argument longer than anyone was accusing him of abandoning it, who knew the landscape of what he was navigating with a precision that the critique didn't have access to, and who had decided that the response most likely to be understood correctly had not yet been asked for in the right way. And then, in 1957, it was asked for, and Armstrong answered. Not the bebop critique, he never answered that directly, and in not answering it directly, he was making his own statement about what the critique was worth. But the larger question, whether he had been watching, whether he knew, whether the smile was all there was, that question he answered clearly, in direct language, at a specific moment in American history, in a way that those who had been paying attention understood as exactly what it was. Miles Davis said Louis Armstrong was an Uncle Tom. Armstrong never answered. He played the music. He smiled at the audiences. He continued for years without responding to the charge in any form that Miles Davis would have recognized as a response. And then, one day in 1957, he picked up the phone and canceled a government tour and said something about the President of the United States that nobody who knew the jazz world thought Louis Armstrong would ever say. The silence had always been full. It just took the right moment to open.